November 15, 1885. In the glittering assembly rooms of London's West End, where fortunes were cemented and alliances arranged like treaties, one woman dared to defy the most influential man in the peerage. When His Grace, Duke Caspian Beaumont of Blackheath, owner of an estate empire that spanned half the English countryside, extended his hand in what society deemed the proposal of the century, Miss Evanthe Longlace did the unthinkable. She looked into his cold, calculating gray eyes, and spoke a single, devastating word that would shake the very foundations of the ton. No. But what happened next would prove that some men will stop at nothing to possess what they cannot have, even if it means wagering everything they've built. The autumn of 1815 painted London's exclusive streets in shades of russet and gold. But inside the Longlace townhouse on Grosvenor Square, Evanthe felt nothing but the chill of impending doom. At 22, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that made seasoned gentlemen stumble over their words. Cascading auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper, brilliant emerald eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets, and a graceful bearing that spoke of both privilege and intelligence. Yet for all her advantages, she felt more like a prized hunter being prepared for market than a young woman with dreams of her own. Stand straighter, Evanthe. Her mother, Mrs. Henrietta Longlace, commanded from her velvet chaise, her sharp eyes scrutinizing every detail of her daughter's appearance. The Duke will be here within the hour, and everything must be perfect. Duke Caspian Beaumont of Blackheath. Even his name carried the weight of an empire. At 35, he commanded the largest network of estates and holdings in the three kingdoms, his influence stretching from the bustling docks of London to the grand manor houses of the north. Society pages described him as devastatingly handsome, tall and broad-shouldered, with piercing gray eyes and dark hair that never seemed out of place. But Evanthe had seen something else in those eyes during their brief encounters at various social functions. A coldness that suggested he viewed everything, including people, as assets to be acquired. The Longlace family's silk-weaving fortune, while substantial, had suffered recent setbacks. Trade embargoes and poor investments had strained their resources, and whispers of financial difficulty had begun circulating among the ton. The proposed union with Duke Caspian wasn't just advantageous, it was essential for the family's survival. "Remember, my love," her father, Lord Percival Longlace, added from behind his newspaper, though his voice carried an edge of desperation he tried to mask. "This alliance will secure not just your future, but the future of our entire family. The Duke's proposal is a blessing beyond measure." Evanthe moved to the tall windows, overlooking the square, watching carriages roll past in the fading daylight. Each clip-clop of horses' hooves seemed to count down the moments until her freedom would be signed away. She had harbored secret dreams of love, real love, the kind she read about in novels, hidden beneath her mattress. She imagined a man who would see her mind as beautiful as her face, who would value her thoughts and encourage her secret passion for writing. "His Grace is here," announced their butler, his voice cutting through her reverie like a blade. Duke Caspian Beaumont entered their drawing room with the confidence of a man accustomed to owning everything he surveyed. His perfectly tailored black coat emphasized his imposing frame, and his smile, though charming to observers, never quite reached his eyes. He moved through the room as if he were already its master, appraising the furnishings with the same calculating gaze he used on estate ledgers. "Lord and Lady Longlace," he said, his voice smooth as aged port. "And the lovely Miss Evanthe." His eyes lingered on her, in a way that made her skin crawl, as if he were mentally cataloging her attributes like items in a ledger. The conversation that followed was a carefully choreographed dance of pleasantries and veiled negotiations. Duke Caspian spoke of his latest land acquisitions, his plans for expanding his holdings in Ireland, and his need for a suitable wife to grace his various stately homes. He never once asked Evanthe about her interests, her thoughts, or her dreams. She was clearly just another acquisition to be added to his vast collection. "Miss Longlace," he said finally, turning his full attention to her, "perhaps you would join me for a private word in the conservatory?" Her parents' eager nods left her no choice. As they walked among the carefully manicured exotic plants, Duke Caspian's demeanor shifted slightly, revealing glimpses of the ruthless lord beneath the polished exterior. "You understand, of course, that this union would be mutually beneficial," he said, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "Your family's considerable trade connections complement my landed empire perfectly. And you, my dear, would become one of the most powerful women in the peerage." Evanthe felt her heart racing, but not with excitement, with dread. "And what of affection, your grace? What of compatibility and shared interests?" His laugh was cold and dismissive. "Affection is a luxury for those who can afford it, Miss Longlace. We are securing a dynasty. Love is for poets and dreamers." As they returned to the house, Evanthe caught sight of her reflection in the drawing-room mirror. She looked like a beautiful doll, perfectly dressed and positioned, but utterly lifeless. The weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Duke Caspian spent another hour discussing terms with her parents. Terms that included not just financial arrangements, but specific clauses about her behavior, her social obligations, and even her correspondence. She would be expected to host elaborate balls, support his political ambitions, and produce heirs to continue the Beaumont line. Her own desires were never mentioned. As the evening drew to a close, Duke Caspian approached her one final time. "I trust you understand the honor being bestowed upon you, Miss Longlace. I shall call upon you tomorrow evening for your formal answer, though I'm certain a woman of your intelligence recognizes the wisdom of this arrangement." After he departed, the Longlace townhouse felt smaller somehow, as if his presence had consumed all the air. Evanthe retreated to her room, where she sat at her writing desk and stared at the blank page before her. Tomorrow, she would be expected to say yes to a life of gilded captivity, to surrender her dreams for the sake of duty and financial security. But as she picked up her pen and began to write, not the acceptance letter her parents expected, but a story about a woman who chose her own destiny, Evanthe Longlace began to wonder if there might be another way. What would happen if, for once, in her carefully controlled life, she dared to disappoint everyone and follow her heart instead? The Duke of Blackheath's London residence blazed with 1,000 candles on the evening of November 15th, 1815. Duke Caspian had spared no expense for what he proclaimed would be the social event of the season, a grand ball where he intended to announce his engagement to Miss Evanthe Longlace before the town's most influential families. The manor's marble halls echoed with the sounds of a full orchestra, while footmen in pristine livery glided between guests, carrying silver trays of champagne and delicacies imported from Europe. Evanthe arrived with her parents in the Longlace carriage, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that her mother had commissioned specifically for this evening, a creation that emphasized her slender waist and highlighted the porcelain perfection of her shoulders. Sapphires glittered at her throat, a gift from Duke Caspian that felt more like a collar than jewelry. "Remember, darling," her mother whispered as they ascended the grand staircase, "tonight secures our family's future. You must not disappoint us." The ballroom was a vision of opulence that would have taken Evanthe's breath away under different circumstances. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across walls, adorned with priceless paintings, while exotic flowers from the Duke's conservatories perfumed the air. The cream of the ton had gathered: the Melbournes, the Sutherlands, the Cavendishes, all eager to witness what they believed would be the merger of two great fortunes. Duke Caspian appeared at her side almost immediately, resplendent in white tie and tails, his dark hair gleaming under the chandelier light. "Miss Longlace," he said, offering his arm with practiced gallantry, "you look absolutely exquisite, a worthy future Duchess of Blackheath." As they moved through the crowd, Evanthe noticed how conversations paused when they passed, how women's fans fluttered with whispered speculations, how men's eyes followed them with a mixture of envy and calculation. She felt like an exhibit in a museum, beautiful but lifeless, admired but not truly seen. "Your Grace," approached Lady Caroline Wentworth, one of society's most influential matrons. "We're all simply breathless with anticipation for your announcement. Miss Longlace is such a fortunate young lady. Duke Caspian's smile was triumphant. Indeed, Lady Wentworth, Miss Longlace has proven herself to be everything I require in a wife. Beautiful, well-bred, and appropriately manageable. The word manageable struck Evanthe like a physical blow. She wasn't a woman to him. She was a possession to be managed, controlled, displayed when convenient. Her fingers tightened on her fan as she struggled to maintain her composure. The evening progressed with agonizing slowness. Duke Caspian paraded her from group to group, discussing their future as if she weren't standing right beside him. He spoke of the children they would have, the estate she would manage, the social obligations she would fulfill. Never once did he mention her thoughts, her feelings, or her dreams. The wedding will be held at St. George's, Hanover Square. Naturally, he informed the gathered crowd during dinner. Miss Longlace will, of course, relocate to my primary estate in the Peak District, where she can focus entirely on her duties as my wife. Evanthe's younger sister, Miss Clarissa Longlace, who had accompanied them to the ball, leaned close during a brief moment when the Duke was distracted by business conversation. "Oh, Evanthe," she whispered, her eyes bright with envy. "You're so incredibly lucky. To think you'll be the most powerful woman in London. I would give anything to be in your position." Clarissa's words stung more than she could have imagined. Her own sister saw only the wealth and status, completely blind to the prison bars being constructed around Evanthe's life. At 19, Clarissa possessed the same Longlace beauty, but with a calculating ambition that reminded Evanthe uncomfortably of Duke Caspian himself. As the evening reached its crescendo, Duke Caspian called for the orchestra to cease playing. The ballroom fell silent as he moved to the center of the dance floor, his commanding presence drawing every eye in the room. Evanthe felt her legs trembling beneath her silk gown as she realized the moment had arrived. "Distinguished friends," Duke Caspian's voice carried easily across the vast room. "Tonight marks a momentous occasion. Not just for myself, but for the future of British commerce and the peerage. I have the honor of announcing my engagement to Miss Evanthe Longlace, a union that will join two of our nation's most prominent families." Applause erupted throughout the ballroom as Duke Caspian extended his hand toward Evanthe. She could see her parents' faces glowing with pride and relief, could feel the weight of hundreds of expectant gazes upon her. This was the moment she was supposed to step forward, to accept her fate with grace and gratitude. Instead, Evanthe Longlace did something that would be whispered about in London drawing rooms for decades to come. She remained perfectly still, her emerald eyes meeting Duke Caspian's with unwavering determination. "I'm afraid there has been a misunderstanding, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I have not accepted your proposal, nor do I intend to." The ballroom erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Duke Caspian's face transformed from confident triumph to thunderous rage in the span of a heartbeat. "Miss Longlace," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "Surely you jest. We have an arrangement." "You have an arrangement with my parents," Evanthe replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I am not a commodity to be traded, Your Grace. I am a woman with my own mind, my own heart, and my own dreams, and I choose not to marry you." The silence that followed was deafening. Lady Longlace's face had gone white as parchment, while Lord Longlace looked as if he might collapse from apoplexy. Clarissa's mouth hung open in shock, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and secret excitement at the scandal unfolding before her. Duke Caspian's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "You ungrateful little fool," he hissed, stepping closer to her with barely contained fury. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? What you're doing to your family's reputation?" "I'm choosing freedom over a golden cage," Evanthe replied, her chin raised defiantly. "I would rather face uncertainty than surrender my soul to a man who sees me as nothing more than a beautiful ornament for his collection." The Duke's eyes blazed with a rage that made several nearby guests step back in alarm. "You will regret this humiliation, Miss Longlace." No one refuses Caspian Beaumont and escapes the consequences. With that ominous declaration, he turned on his heel and strode from the ballroom, leaving behind a crowd of stunned socialites and one young woman who had just sacrificed everything for the chance to choose her own destiny. As the whispers and scandalized conversations erupted around her, Evanthe felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had burned every bridge, destroyed her family's carefully laid plans, and made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. But for the first time in her life, she had spoken her truth, and nothing, not even the storm of consequences she knew was coming, could take that moment of authentic courage away from her. The Longlace townhouse felt like a tomb in the days following what the Ton had dubbed the Great Refusal. Evanthe's parents moved through their home like ghosts, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and financial terror that grew more pronounced with each passing hour. The morning papers had been merciless, with headlines screaming, "Duke spurned by ungrateful heiress," and the Longlace scandal rocks high society. Lord Percival aged a decade in 3 days. His silk business, already struggling, now faced complete social ostracism. Orders were mysteriously cancelled, credit lines withdrawn, and longtime business partners suddenly became unavailable for meetings. Duke Caspian's influence reached into every corner of London's commercial world, and his displeasure was being felt like a plague spreading through the Longlace family's livelihood. "You've destroyed us," her mother whispered on the 4th morning, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, her eyes red from sleepless nights. 22 years I've groomed you for this moment, and you've thrown it all away for what? Pride? Foolish romantic notions? Evanthe sat in the morning room, her hands folded in her lap, watching the autumn rain streak down the windows. She had not slept properly since the ball, but neither had she wavered in her conviction. "I've chosen dignity over degradation, Mother. I cannot apologize for that." Clarissa, meanwhile, had taken to avoiding Evanthe entirely. Her earlier excitement at the scandal replaced by cold resentment, as she realized how her sister's actions might affect her own matrimonial prospects. "No respectable family will want to associate with us now," she had declared the previous evening. "You've ruined my chances as well as your own." It was on this gray morning that salvation arrived in the most unexpected form. Mrs. Augusta Peyton, Evanthe's great-aunt and the family's most notorious black sheep, appeared at their door like a force of nature wrapped in a traveling cloak. At 68, Aunt Augusta possessed the same Longlace beauty, though weathered by years of adventure and independence. She had scandalized the family decades earlier by refusing marriage, traveling the world alone, and establishing herself as a successful art dealer in Boston, Massachusetts. "Henrietta," Aunt Augusta announced, sweeping into the drawing room without ceremony, "you look absolutely dreadful. And you, Percival, appear to be on the verge of apoplexy. Where is my brave niece?" Evanthe appeared in the doorway, her heart lifting at the sight of the one family member who had always encouraged her unconventional thoughts. Aunt Augusta studied her with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Ah, there she is, the young woman who had the courage to tell Caspian Beaumont exactly what he could do with his arrogant proposal." Aunt Augusta's smile was fierce with approval. "I came as soon as I heard. Pack your things, my dear. You're coming to Boston with me." "Augusta," Lady Longlace protested weakly, "Evanthe needs to remain here and find some way to repair this disaster. Perhaps if she were to write a letter of apology." "Apologize?" Aunt Augusta's voice could have cut glass. "For refusing to marry a man who treats women like livestock? Absolutely not. Evanthe, go pack. We leave within the hour." The voyage across the Atlantic felt like an escape from prison. As the endless sea rolled past their first-class cabin window, Evanthe felt the weight of expectation and judgment gradually lifting from her shoulders. Augusta regaled her with stories of her travels, her art acquisitions in Paris, her adventures in the American colonies, her friendships with writers and artists who lived by their own rules rather than society's dictates. "You know, my dear," Aunt Augusta said as they shared tea and biscuits, "I was once engaged to a perfectly suitable gentleman, wealthy, well-connected, approved by the family. But he had the personality of a wet fish and the imagination of a turnip. I broke the engagement 3 days before the wedding, What happened? Evanthe asked, fascinated by this family history she'd never heard. Scandal, naturally. My parents disowned me for 6 months, but I took the money I would have spent on a wedding and used it to travel to Europe instead. Best decision I ever made. Aunt Augusta's eyes twinkled with mischief. I learned that a woman with intelligence and determination can create her own destiny, regardless of what society expects. Boston proved to be a revelation. Aunt Augusta's townhouse on Beacon Hill was filled with artwork from around the world, books in multiple languages, and an atmosphere of intellectual freedom that Evanthe had never experienced. The very air seemed to vibrate with possibility. Tomorrow, Aunt Augusta announced over dinner their first evening. I'm taking you to meet some friends of mine. There's a literary salon that meets weekly. Writers, artists, progressive thinkers, people who value ideas over inheritance. The salon met in the elegant home of Mrs. Patience Atherton, a widow who had transformed her grief into purpose by supporting emerging artists and writers. The gathering was unlike anything Evanthe had ever experienced. Men and women engaged in passionate debates about literature, politics, and social reform. Ideas flowed as freely as the claret, and no one seemed concerned with bloodlines or bank accounts. It was there that Evanthe first encountered Mr. Tobias Reed, and her world shifted on its axis. Mr. Reed was not conventionally handsome in the way Duke Caspian was. At 32, he possessed an understated appeal. Medium height, with warm brown hair that refused to stay perfectly groomed, intelligent hazel eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and hands that spoke of both gentleness and strength. He had recently returned from studying medicine in Edinburgh and was establishing a practice that focused on treating the poor as well as the wealthy. Miss Longlace, Mrs. Atherton, introduced them. I'd like you to meet Mr. Reed. He's been telling us about his work with immigrant families in the North End. A pleasure, Miss Longlace, Mr. Reed said, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested New England origins. I understand you're visiting from London. Escaping from London would be more accurate, Evanthe replied, surprised by her own honesty. Mr. Reed's eyes showed genuine interest rather than the calculating assessment she was accustomed to from gentlemen. Ah, a fellow refugee from society's expectations. I left Connecticut for similar reasons, too many people who cared more about my family's money than my medical aspirations. Their conversation continued throughout the evening, ranging from literature to social reform to the challenges facing modern medicine. Mr. Reed listened to her opinions with respect, challenged her thoughts without condescension, and shared his own dreams of establishing a hospital that would serve all people regardless of their ability to pay. You have remarkable insights into social issues, he told her, as the evening wound down. Have you considered writing about these topics? The world needs voices like yours. Evanthe felt her heart flutter, not with the nervous dread she'd experienced around Duke Caspian, but with genuine excitement. I do write, actually, though nothing that's ever been published. Perhaps that could change, Mr. Reed suggested, with a warm smile. Mrs. Atherton knows several editors who are always looking for fresh perspectives. As they walked home through Boston's gaslit streets, Aunt Augusta observed her niece's glowing expression with satisfaction. Mr. Reed seems like a remarkable young man. He is, Evanthe agreed, then paused. Aunt Augusta, is it possible that I could build a life here? A real life? Based on my own choices, rather than others' expectations? My dear girl, Aunt Augusta replied, linking their arms. Not only is it possible, it's exactly what you're going to do. But first, you need to discover who Evanthe Longlace truly is when she's free to be herself. Over the following weeks, Evanthe threw herself into Boston's intellectual community with an enthusiasm she'd never known she possessed. She attended lectures, participated in discussions about abolition, and began writing articles about social reform that Mrs. Atherton helped her submit to progressive publications. Mr. Reed became a regular part of her life, their friendship deepening with each shared conversation and common cause. He introduced her to his work among Boston's immigrant population, where her natural compassion and quick intelligence made her an invaluable volunteer. For the first time in her life, Evanthe felt useful, valued for her mind rather than her beauty or family connections. But even as she built this new life, letters from London reminded her that Duke Caspian had not forgotten her rejection. Her father wrote of continued business pressures, of social ostracism that showed no signs of abating. Clarissa's letters grew increasingly bitter, blaming Evanthe for her own diminished prospects. Most disturbing were the reports that Duke Caspian had been making inquiries about Evanthe's whereabouts, that he had been heard declaring his intention to reclaim what was promised to him. The man who was accustomed to owning everything he desired had not accepted defeat gracefully. As winter settled over Boston, Evanthe found herself torn between the happiness she was building and the guilt over her family's suffering. Mr. Reed, with his gentle perception, noticed her growing anxiety. "You're troubled," he observed one snowy evening as they walked through the common after a particularly engaging salon discussion. "Is it your family in London?" Evanthe nodded, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I sometimes wonder if I was selfish to choose my own happiness over their security. Duke Caspian's revenge has been thorough and merciless." Mr. Reed stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Evanthe, you cannot sacrifice your life to appease a tyrant's wounded pride. That would only encourage his behavior and doom some other woman to the fate you escaped." His words carried weight, but Evanthe couldn't shake the feeling that her battle with Duke Caspian was far from over. What would happen when he discovered her new life, her growing happiness, her budding romance with a man who saw her as an equal rather than a possession? And what lengths would a man of unlimited resources go to in order to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his? Spring arrived in Boston like a promise fulfilled, and with it came an invitation that would change everything. Mrs. Patience Atherton burst into Aunt Augusta's drawing room on a brilliant April morning, her eyes sparkling with excitement and a letter clutched in her gloved hand. "Evanthe, my dear," she announced breathlessly, "you simply must hear this. The Royal Society for Literary Women is hosting their annual gala in London, and they've specifically requested that you attend as their featured speaker on social reform." Evanthe looked up from her writing desk, where she had been working on an article about healthcare access for the working poor. Over the past 6 months, her pieces had gained recognition in progressive circles, published in respected journals under her own name. The shy, compliant girl who had fled London had transformed into a confident woman with a voice that mattered. London? Evanthe's heart skipped a beat. "Mrs. Atherton, I'm not certain that's wise. My family's situation there remains complicated." Aunt Augusta, who had been arranging flowers from her garden, set down her shears with a decisive click. "Nonsense. You cannot hide from that pompous Duke forever. Besides, it's time London society saw what you've become. A woman of substance and achievement." Mr. Tobias Reed, who had become a regular visitor to the Peyton household, looked up from the medical journal he'd been reading. Over the months, their friendship had deepened into something beautiful and profound. He respected her intellect, supported her ambitions, and never once suggested she should be anything other than exactly who she was. "I think you should go," he said quietly, his warm hazel eyes meeting hers. "Your voice deserves to be heard, especially by those who once dismissed you. And," he added with a gentle smile, "I could arrange to attend the medical conference happening that same week. You wouldn't have to face London alone." The thought of Tobias being nearby gave Evanthe courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Very well," she said, her chin lifting with determination. "I'll accept their invitation." 3 weeks later, Evanthe Longlace returned to London a completely different woman. Gone was the compliant debutante in pastel silks. In her place stood a confident author and social reformer, dressed in a sophisticated emerald green gown that complemented her eyes and spoke of quiet authority rather than desperate beauty. Her auburn hair was styled in a more mature fashion, and her bearing radiated the self-assurance that came from knowing her own worth. The Literary Society Gala was held at the prestigious Almack's Assembly Rooms, and the guest list included London's most progressive thinkers, alongside curious members of traditional society. Evanthe's parents had declined to attend. Her father's business remained under siege, and her mother could not bear the thought of facing the whispers and stares. Clarissa, however, had managed to secure an invitation through her new beau, a minor gentleman who hoped to curry favor with Duke Caspian. She arrived in a gown of pale pink that emphasized her youth and beauty, her eyes bright with malicious curiosity about her sister's transformation. "My goodness, Evanthe," Clarissa said when they encountered each other in the ladies' retiring room. "You look so different, older, more serious. I suppose that's what happens when one abandons proper society for radical ideas." "I prefer to think of it as growing into myself," Evanthe replied calmly, adjusting her gloves. "How are mother and father?" Clarissa's expression darkened. "Struggling, thanks to your selfishness. Father's lost 3 more major contracts this month. Duke Caspian's influence reaches everywhere. You know, he hasn't forgotten your humiliation of him." Before Evanthe could respond, a commotion in the main ballroom drew their attention. Through the doorway, she could see the crowd parting like the Red Sea, and her blood turned to ice as she recognized the commanding figure striding through the room. Duke Caspian Beaumont of Blackheath had arrived. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall, imposing, devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored evening wear. But there was something different in his bearing now, a harder edge that spoke of a man who had spent months nursing wounded pride and plotting revenge. His piercing gray eyes swept the room until they found her, and the smile that crossed his lips was anything but pleasant. "Miss Longlace," he said, approaching with the confidence of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "How unexpected to find you here. I was under the impression you had fled to Massachusetts to escape the consequences of your poor judgment." The conversations around them gradually ceased as people sensed the tension crackling between them. Evanthe felt every eye in the room upon her, waiting to see if she would crumble under the Duke's intimidating presence, as so many others had. Instead, she drew upon the strength she had discovered in herself over the past months. "Your Grace," she replied with perfect composure. "How kind of you to attend an event celebrating women's intellectual achievements. Though, I confess surprise. I wouldn't have thought such progressive ideals would interest you." Duke Caspian's eyes flashed with anger at her subtle insult, but his smile never wavered. "Oh, I find myself fascinated by progressive women these days. There's nothing temporary about a woman's right to choose her own destiny," Evanthe replied, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. "Though I understand that concept might be foreign to someone accustomed to treating people as property." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. No one spoke to Duke Caspian with such boldness. The Duke stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that only she could hear. "You think you've won something, don't you? Playing at being an independent woman in Boston, writing your little articles, pretending you don't need the protection of a powerful husband. But you're still the same naive girl who threw away the opportunity of a lifetime." "You're wrong," Evanthe said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm not the same woman at all. I've discovered what it means to be valued for my mind, my character, my contributions to society. I've learned the difference between protection and possession." It was at that moment that Mr. Tobias Reed appeared at her side, having just arrived from his medical conference. He took in the situation immediately. The tense confrontation, the watching crowd, the barely contained fury in Duke Caspian's eyes. "Evanthe," he said warmly, offering her his arm, "I believe they're about to announce your speech. Shall we?" Duke Caspian's gaze shifted to Mr. Reed, and Evanthe saw something dangerous flicker in those cold gray eyes. "And you are?" "Mr. Tobias Reed," he replied with quiet dignity, not intimidated by the Duke's imposing presence. "I have the honor of being Miss Longlace's close friend." The word friend hung in the air, but everyone present understood its deeper implications. Duke Caspian's jaw tightened as he realized that Evanthe had not only escaped his control, but had found someone else, someone who clearly valued her for reasons that had nothing to do with family connections or financial advantage. "How touching," the Duke said, his voice dripping with disdain. "A country doctor and a disgraced debutante. What a perfectly mediocre match." Mr. Reed's expression remained calm, but Evanthe felt the tension in his arm. "I find nothing mediocre about a woman who has the courage to stand up for her principles, even when it costs her everything. That kind of integrity is rarer than any fortune." The Duke's mask of civility finally began to slip. "Integrity?" He laughed harshly. "She destroyed her family's reputation and livelihood for the sake of childish rebellion. That's not integrity. It's selfishness." "No," Evanthe said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Selfishness would have been accepting your proposal and condemning myself to a lifetime of misery simply to maintain appearances. What I did was choose authenticity over convenience. Love over luxury." The word love seemed to strike Duke Caspian like a physical blow. His eyes blazed with a fury that made several nearby guests step back in alarm. "Love," he repeated, the word sounding like a curse on his lips. "You think this physician can give you what I offered? You think his modest income and middle-class aspirations can compare to the empire I would have shared with you?" "He offers me something you never could," Evanthe replied, her hand tightening on Mr. Reed's arm. "Respect, partnership, the freedom to be myself, rather than a beautiful ornament for your collection." Duke Caspian's composure shattered completely. "You will regret this," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Both of you. I'm not a man who accepts defeat gracefully, and I have resources you cannot imagine. This is far from over." With that ominous declaration, he turned and strode from the assembly rooms, leaving behind a room full of stunned socialites and one young woman who had just publicly chosen love over power for the second time in her life. The morning after the Literary Society Gala dawned gray and ominous over London, as if the very sky reflected the storm brewing in the wake of Evanthe's public confrontation with Duke Caspian. She awoke in her childhood bedroom at the Longlace townhouse, where she had reluctantly agreed to stay for the remainder of her visit, despite the palpable tension that filled the house like smoke. Her parents had maintained a cold silence since her return, their disappointment and fear radiating from them in waves. The morning newspapers, which had once again seized upon the Longlace family drama with gleeful abandon, lay scattered across the breakfast table like accusations. "Duke spurned again," screamed one headline, while another proclaimed the Longlace heiress's second scandal. Mr. Tobias Reed had sent word that he would call upon her that afternoon, but even the prospect of seeing him couldn't entirely dispel the unease that had settled in her chest like a cold stone. Duke Caspian's parting words echoed in her mind. "I have resources you cannot imagine. This is far from over." It was Clarissa who brought the first hint of what those resources might entail. She swept into the morning room, where Evanthe sat writing letters, her face flushed with excitement and malicious satisfaction. "You'll never guess what I heard at Lady Wentworth's tea yesterday," Clarissa announced, settling herself in the chair across from her sister with theatrical flair. "Duke Caspian has made the most extraordinary offer." Evanthe set down her pen, her stomach clenching with foreboding. "What sort of offer?" Clarissa's eyes glittered with barely contained glee. "He's offered to purchase Father's entire silk-weaving concern at twice its current market value. Can you imagine? All our financial troubles would disappear overnight. Father could pay off every debt and still have enough left over to restore our family's position in society." The blood drained from Evanthe's face as the implications became clear. "And what does he want in return?" "Why, nothing at all," Clarissa said, with false innocence. "Except, of course, that you return to London permanently and accept his renewed proposal of marriage. He's even agreed to overlook your indiscretions in Boston and provide you with a generous allowance for your charitable interests." Evanthe felt as if the walls were closing in around her. Duke Caspian had found the perfect weapon: her family's desperate financial situation and her own sense of guilt over their suffering. He was offering them salvation, but at the cost of her freedom and happiness. "Surely father wouldn't consider such a thing," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Clarissa's smile was sharp as a blade. "Wouldn't he? He's been closeted with his accountants all morning, reviewing the offer. Mother is already planning the wedding announcements. They see it as divine providence, a chance to undo the damage you've caused." Before Evanthe could respond, their father appeared in the doorway, his face haggard, but his eyes bright with desperate hope. "Evanthe, my dear, we need to talk." The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of Evanthe's life. Lord Percival laid out their financial situation with brutal honesty. The mounting debts, the cancelled contracts, the social ostracism that had destroyed his business relationships. Duke Caspian's offer represented not just salvation, but resurrection. "I'm not asking you to sacrifice yourself for us," her father said, though his words rang hollow. "But perhaps you were too hasty in your judgment of the Duke. He's a powerful man, yes, but power can be used for good. Think of the charitable work you could accomplish as his wife, the influence you could wield for worthy causes." "Father," Evanthe said gently, "you're asking me to marry a man who sees me as property, who has spent months systematically destroying our family's livelihood to force my compliance. How could any good come from such a union?" Her mother, who had been silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke. "Because sometimes, Evanthe, we must sacrifice our personal desires for the greater good. Your marriage to Duke Caspian would secure not just our family's future, but Clarissa's prospects as well. Would you condemn us all for the sake of your romantic notions?" The weight of their expectations, their desperation, their barely concealed resentment pressed down on Evanthe like a physical force. She excused herself and fled to the garden, where she had once walked with Duke Caspian and felt the first stirrings of rebellion against her predetermined fate. It was there that Mr. Reed found her an hour later, sitting on a stone bench beneath the bare branches of an oak tree, her face pale with anguish. "Evanthe," he said softly, settling beside her. "What happened? You look as if you've seen a ghost." She told him everything. Duke Caspian's offer, her family's pressure, the impossible choice that had been laid before her. Mr. Reed listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. "So, he's trying to buy you," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger, "like a piece of property at auction." "He's offering my family everything they need to survive," Evanthe replied miserably. "How can I refuse when my selfishness has already caused them so much suffering?" Mr. Reed took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "Evanthe, look at me. What Duke Caspian is doing isn't generosity. It's extortion. He's deliberately created this crisis to force your compliance. If you give in to his demands now, you'll only encourage him to use the same tactics against other women in the future. But my family, your family will survive," Mr. Reed said firmly. "Your father is a capable businessman. With time and effort, he can rebuild without selling his daughter to a tyrant. But if you sacrifice yourself to Duke Caspian's ego, you'll never recover from that choice." Evanthe felt tears threatening to spill over. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to watch them suffer while I pursue my own happiness." Mr. Reed was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of decision that made her heart skip. "Then perhaps it's time I made my own position clear." He slipped from the bench to kneel before her, pulling a small velvet box from his coat pocket. Evanthe's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a simple but beautiful sapphire ring. Not the ostentatious display of wealth that Duke Caspian would have chosen, but something elegant and meaningful. "Evanthe Longlace," Mr. Reed said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I love you. Not for your beauty, though you are beautiful. Not for your family's connections, though I respect them. I love you for your courage, your compassion, your brilliant mind, and your generous heart. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The contrast between this proposal and Duke Caspian's arrogant assumption of her compliance could not have been starker. Mr. Reed was offering her partnership, respect, and genuine love. Everything she had dreamed of, but never dared hope for. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Tobias. Yes, with all my heart." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Evanthe felt a surge of strength and clarity. This was her choice, made freely, and with full knowledge of the consequences. Whatever Duke Caspian's reaction, whatever pressure her family applied, she would not waver again. The announcement of Evanthe and Tobias's engagement sent shockwaves through both families. Mr. Reed's modest but respectable background made him an acceptable match in normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. The Longlace family's reaction was swift and devastating. "You've doomed us all," her mother declared, her voice breaking with despair. "Duke Caspian will withdraw his offer, and we'll lose everything. How can you be so selfish?" Clarissa was even more vicious in her condemnation. "You've destroyed my chances along with your own," she spat. "No decent family will want to associate with us now. I hope your precious doctor is worth our complete social ruin." But it was her father's quiet disappointment that cut deepest. "I had hoped," he said sadly, "that you might have learned something from the consequences of your first refusal. But I see you're determined to follow your heart, regardless of the cost to those who love you." The next morning brought Duke Caspian's response, delivered by his personal secretary in the form of a formal letter. The offer to purchase the Longlace silk weaving business was withdrawn, effective immediately. Furthermore, any firm that chose to deal with the Longlace family would find themselves excluded from all Beaumont enterprises, a death sentence in London's interconnected commercial world. But the letter also contained something unexpected, a personal note from Duke Caspian himself, written in his bold, aggressive handwriting. "Miss Longlace, you continue to underestimate both my determination and my resources. Your engagement to Mr. Reed merely delays the inevitable. I am prepared to wait, to watch, and to act when the moment is right. You will be mine one way or another. Some prizes are worth any price." Tobias read the note with growing alarm. "Evanthe, this sounds like more than wounded pride. This man is obsessed with you. Perhaps we should consider leaving London immediately." "And go where?" Evanthe asked, though she was beginning to think he might be right. "He has resources across the country, and I won't spend my life running from him." Their wedding was planned for the following month, a simple ceremony that would take place in Boston under Aunt Augusta's protective auspices. But as the date approached, Duke Caspian's presence seemed to loom over their preparations like a dark cloud. Reports reached them of his inquiries about Tobias's background, his medical practice, his family in Connecticut. The Duke was clearly gathering information, looking for weaknesses to exploit. More disturbing still were the rumors that he had been making discreet inquiries about the legality of various business practices, as if searching for grounds to bring charges against his rivals. "He's looking for a way to destroy you professionally," Evanthe told Tobias one evening as they walked through Boston Common. "I can't let you suffer for my choices." "Our choices," Tobias corrected firmly. "We're in this together now, Evanthe. Whatever Duke Caspian plans, we'll face it as husband and wife." But even as they spoke of facing the future together, both knew that Duke Caspian's obsession with possessing Evanthe had moved far beyond rational business competition. They were dealing with a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, and who possessed the resources to make their lives a living hell if they continued to defy him. The question was no longer whether Duke Caspian would strike again, but when, and whether their love would be strong enough to survive whatever weapon he chose to wield against them. As their wedding day approached, Evanthe found herself torn between joy at her approaching marriage and dread at what Duke Caspian might do to prevent it. She had chosen her path, but the cost of that choice was still being calculated, and she feared the final price might be higher than even she was prepared to pay. 6 months after her wedding to Mr. Tobias Reed, Evanthe stood at the tall windows of their brownstone home on Commonwealth Avenue, watching the first snow of winter transform Boston into a crystalline wonderland. The morning light filtered through the frost-etched glass, casting dancing patterns across the Persian rug that had been Aunt Augusta's wedding gift. Her reflection gazed back at her, a woman transformed, No longer the frightened debutante who had fled London in disgrace, but someone who had found her true self in the freedom to choose her own path. The simple gold band on her finger caught the winter sunlight as she adjusted the heavy velvet curtains. It was so different from the ostentatious engagement ring Duke Caspian would have bestowed upon her. This modest circle of gold represented something infinitely more valuable. A partnership, freely chosen, a love freely given, and a future built on mutual respect rather than financial transaction. Their home reflected the life they had built together. Comfortable, but not ostentatious, filled with books, medical journals, and the artwork of struggling artists they had befriended. Mrs. Reed called Mary O'Sullivan from the hallway, her Irish accent still thick despite 3 years in America. The young woman had come to them through Mr. Reed's work at the free clinic, a widow with 2 small children who needed both employment and medical care. Here, she was part of their extended family. "There's a gentleman here to see you, ma'am. Says he's come all the way from London on urgent business. Looks like quality, he does, but not the sort that puts on airs." Evanthe's blood turned to ice water in her veins. For months, she and Tobias had lived in peaceful obscurity, building their life together without interference. She had begun to hope, perhaps foolishly, that Duke Caspian's obsession had finally burned itself out. But as she made her way to the front parlor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, she steeled herself for another confrontation. Instead, she found herself face to face with a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that spoke of wealth without ostentation. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, but his eyes held a kindness that reminded her somehow of her father in happier times. "Mrs. Reed," he said, rising from the wingback chair where he had been waiting and offering her a respectful bow. "My name is Mr. James Morrison, and I'm an attorney representing certain interested parties in London. I apologize for calling without an appointment, but the matter I wish to discuss is both urgent and delicate. Might I have a word with you privately?" Evanthe's first instinct was to refuse. But something in the man's manner, a genuine respect in his bearing, a warmth in his eyes that spoke of integrity rather than calculation, made her pause. "Very well, Mr. Morrison," she said, settling herself in the chair across from him while maintaining a careful distance. "Though I should warn you that if you've come here on behalf of Duke Caspian, you're wasting both our time. My position regarding that gentleman has not changed and never will." Mr. Morrison's expression shifted to one of surprise, then understanding. "Ah, I see why you might assume that, given your history with the Duke. But I assure you, Mrs. Reed, I represent parties who are very much opposed to Duke Caspian's interests. In fact, what I'm about to tell you may come as quite a shock." Over the next hour, as snow continued to fall outside their windows, Mr. Morrison revealed a story that changed everything Evanthe thought she knew about her situation. He represented a consortium of London businessmen, politicians, and reformers who had been quietly building a case against Duke Caspian for years. "Your family's situation was not unique, Mrs. Reed," Mr. Morrison explained, his voice grave as he opened a leather portfolio filled with documents. "Duke Caspian has used similar tactics against dozens of businesses over the years, creating financial crises through market manipulation and intimidation, then swooping in with offers that amount to legalized extortion. But your very public rejection of his advances and the courage you showed in standing up to him, not once, but twice, has inspired others to come forward with their own stories." He withdrew a thick folder from his briefcase, its contents representing months of careful investigation. "We've been building a comprehensive case against Duke Caspian's empire. Anti-monopoly violations, illegal monopolistic practices, intimidation of competitors, bribery of public officials, and systematic destruction of any individual or business that dares to cross him. Your testimony about his threats and his deliberate sabotage of your family's silk-weaving business could be the final piece we need to bring him to justice." Evanthe studied the papers with growing amazement and horror. Page after page detailed a pattern of abuse that stretched back years. Each name was a revelation, each story a mirror of her own family's suffering. "You're saying that other families have suffered as mine did?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dozens of them, Mrs. Reed. The Hendersons lost their shipping company after their daughter refused to dance with the Duke at a charity ball. The Morgans' banking business was systematically undermined after they supported a political candidate the Duke opposed. The scope of his vindictive empire is staggering. But why come to me?" she asked. "Surely these other families, these business owners, would have more concrete evidence of his illegal practices." Mr. Morrison leaned forward, his expression intense. "Because you, Mrs. Reed, are the one who got away. You're the woman who publicly humiliated Duke Caspian not once, but twice, who chose love over luxury, and proved that his money couldn't buy everything he wanted. Your story has captured the public imagination in a way that dry business disputes never could. You've become a symbol of resistance to his tyranny." The weight of this revelation settled over Evanthe like a heavy cloak. Her personal choice to follow her heart had somehow become a rallying cry for others who had suffered under the Duke's vindictive rule. "What would you need from me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change her life once again. "Your testimony before a royal commission. Details about his threats, his business practices, his attempts to coerce you into marriage through financial blackmail. We need you to tell your story, all of it, in a court of law, under oath, where it can become part of the official record." Mr. Morrison's expression grew serious. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Reed. It won't be easy. Duke Caspian has powerful friends, expensive lawyers, and a network of influence. He'll use every resource at his disposal to discredit you." Evanthe felt a familiar flutter of fear in her chest, but it was different now. Not the paralyzing terror of her youth, but the natural apprehension of someone who understood the magnitude of what was being asked of her. She had found peace in Boston. Testifying against Duke Caspian would thrust her back into the spotlight, make her a target once again for his vindictive rage. But as she looked around their parlor, at the photographs of immigrant families they had helped, at the framed articles she had written, she knew there was really only one choice she could make. When Mr. Tobias Reed returned home that evening from his rounds at Massachusetts General Hospital, his medical bag heavy with the tools of healing and his coat dusted with snow, he found Evanthe in their study. She sat surrounded by legal documents, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the gas lamp as she read through page after page of testimony from Duke Caspian's other victims. "Evanthe," he said softly, setting down his bag and moving to her side. "What's all this?" She explained Mr. Morrison's visit, the federal investigation, or rather, the Royal Commission investigation, and the opportunity to finally hold Duke Caspian accountable for years of abuse and intimidation. As she spoke, she watched her husband's expression shift from surprise to concern to a kind of grim determination that reminded her why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. "It's dangerous," Tobias said, after reviewing the papers, his training making him cautious about risks. "If Duke Caspian realizes you're cooperating, there's no telling how he might retaliate. He's already proven he's willing to destroy innocent people to get what he wants." "But if I don't testify," Evanthe replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction, "how many other women will suffer as I did? How many families will be destroyed by his vindictive pride? How many young girls will be forced into marriages with men who see them as property rather than people?" Tobias took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring as always. "Then we do this together," he said simply. "If you're determined to testify, I'll be there every step of the way. We'll face whatever comes as husband and wife, as partners in every sense of the word." The Royal Commission investigation moved with surprising swiftness once Evanthe agreed to cooperate. Mr. Morrison introduced her to a team of barristers who had been building their case for months, waiting for the right moment and the right witness to bring Duke Caspian's empire crashing down. The lead barrister, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont, no relation to the Duke, who had fought her way through the legal world despite the prejudices against women, understood immediately the power of Evanthe's story. "You represent something Duke Caspian can't understand or control," she explained during one of their preparation sessions. "You're a woman who chose authenticity over security, love over luxury, principle over profit. In a society that teaches women to be grateful for whatever scraps of power men choose to give them, you demanded the right to choose your own destiny." The preparation for Evanthe's testimony was exhaustive and emotionally draining. She had to relive every detail of her encounters with Duke Caspian, from their first meeting in her parents' drawing room to his threats at the assembly rooms. She had to describe the systematic destruction of her family's business, the social ostracism they had faced, and the impossible choice she had been forced to make. But as painful as the process was, it was also liberating. For the first time, Evanthe was able to see her story not as a series of personal failures and rebellions, but as part of a larger pattern of abuse that had affected countless innocent people. Her refusal to submit to the Duke's will had not been selfish or naive. It had been an act of courage that had inspired others to come forward with their own stories of suffering and resistance. The trial itself became a sensation that captured the attention of the entire nation. Newspapers from coast to coast covered every detail of the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to witness the downfall of one of England's most powerful men. The story had everything the public craved: wealth, power, romance, betrayal, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. Evanthe's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress that emphasized her dignity rather than her beauty, she took the witness stand with a composure that belied the terror she felt inside. For 3 days, she answered questions about her relationship with Duke Caspian, his threats and intimidation tactics, and the systematic campaign of revenge he had waged against her family. The defense attorneys, as Mr. Morrison had predicted, tried every tactic to discredit her. They painted her as a vindictive woman seeking revenge for imagined slights, a social climber who had rejected Duke Caspian's generous offer and now sought to destroy him out of spite. They questioned her morals, her motivations, and her right to speak for the other victims of the Duke's abuse. But Evanthe had learned much about herself in the months since her wedding. The frightened young woman who had once cowed before Duke Caspian's intimidating presence was gone, replaced by someone who had found her voice and her strength. She answered every question with calm dignity, never allowing the defense attorneys to rattle her or make her doubt the truth of her own experience. "Mrs. Reed," the lead defense attorney asked during a particularly aggressive cross-examination, "isn't it true that you rejected Duke Caspian's proposal, not out of principle, but because you had already formed an inappropriate attachment to Mr. Reed?" Evanthe met his gaze steadily, her voice clear and unwavering. "I rejected Duke Caspian's proposal because he made it clear that he saw me not as a partner or companion, but as a beautiful object to be added to his collection. He never once asked about my thoughts, my dreams, or my desires. He spoke of our marriage as a business transaction that would benefit his empire, not as a union between two people who cared for each other." "But surely," the attorney pressed, "you understood the honor he was bestowing upon you, the security and position his proposal offered." "I understood that he was offering me a gilded cage," Evanthe replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Wealth and position, in exchange for my freedom, my voice, and my right to choose my own destiny. That is not honor. It is a form of slavery dressed up in silk and jewels." The courtroom erupted in murmurs at her words, and Evanthe saw several women in the gallery nodding in agreement. She had spoken not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been told to be grateful for male attention, regardless of how it was offered. Duke Caspian himself cut a pathetic figure throughout the trial. Gone was the commanding presence that had once intimidated London society. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, financial records, witness testimony, documented threats, and intimidation, he appeared smaller. Somehow, his arrogance replaced by desperate attempts to shift blame to subordinates and business partners. When he finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was a masterclass in self-delusion and entitlement. He portrayed himself as a victim of jealous competitors, and ungrateful beneficiaries of his generosity. "I offered Miss Longlace everything a woman could desire," he declared from the witness stand, his voice carrying the same arrogant certainty that had once made Evanthe's blood run cold. Wealth, position, influence, beyond her wildest dreams. I cannot understand why she would choose poverty and obscurity over such opportunities. It was Barrister Mrs. Beaumont who delivered the killing blow during her cross-examination. "Your Grace," she said, her voice sharp as a blade, "in all your testimony about what you offered Mrs. Reed, you have never once mentioned love, affection, or respect. You speak of her as if she were a prize to be won, rather than a human being with her own thoughts and feelings. Do you not see how this attitude might be offensive to a woman of intelligence and dignity?" Duke Caspian's face flushed with anger at the question. Mrs. Reed was a foolish girl who allowed romantic notions to cloud her judgment. She threw away the opportunity of a lifetime for the sake of childish rebellion. Or perhaps, Mrs. Beaumont suggested, she was a wise woman who recognized that some things, love, respect, personal freedom, cannot be bought at any price, no matter how high. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts: anti-monopoly violations, extortion, intimidation, conspiracy to restrain trade, and a dozen other charges that would ensure Duke Caspian spent the next decade behind bars. When the verdict was read, Evanthe felt not triumph, but a profound sense of relief. The man who had haunted her dreams for so long was finally being held accountable for his actions. But it was Duke Caspian's reaction to the sentencing that provided the most telling insight into his character. As he was led away to begin his 10-year prison term, he caught sight of Evanthe in the courtroom gallery. Instead of the rage she expected, she saw something that looked almost like bewilderment in his cold gray eyes. "I could have given you everything," he called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent courtroom. "Wealth, power, position. Why did you choose poverty over privilege? Why did you throw away everything I offered for the sake of a country doctor and a life of mediocrity?" Evanthe rose from her seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon her. This was her moment to deliver her final words to the man who had tried to own her, to speak not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been told to be grateful for male attention. "Because you never understood that some things cannot be bought." "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "Respect, dignity, the right to choose one's own destiny. These have no price, because they can only be freely given. I chose a life of meaning over a life of luxury, authenticity over artifice, partnership over possession, and I have never regretted that choice for a single moment." She paused, looking directly into his eyes for what she knew would be the last time. "You offered me your entire fortune to say yes to your proposal. But what you never realized is that I already possess something infinitely more valuable than money: the freedom to choose my own path, to love whom I wished, and to build a life based on my own values rather than society's expectations. That freedom is worth more than all the gold in your vaults." The aftermath of the trial brought changes that Evanthe could never have anticipated. The publicity surrounding the case had made her a national figure, a symbol of women's courage and independence that resonated far beyond the confines of London society. Letters poured in from across the country, from women thanking her for her courage, from families who had suffered similar abuse, from young girls who saw in her story proof that they too could choose their own destinies. Lord Percival Longlace, freed from Duke Caspian's vindictive persecution, began rebuilding his silk-weaving business with remarkable success. The publicity surrounding the trial had actually enhanced his reputation, as customers flocked to support a family that had stood up to corporate bullying. Within 6 months, Longlace Silks was more profitable than it had ever been, and Lord Percival found himself in the unexpected position of being courted by the same society figures who had shunned him. More surprisingly, Clarissa reached out to her sister for the first time since the wedding. Her marriage to the minor gentleman had proven as loveless and calculating as Evanthe had feared, and she was beginning to understand the wisdom of her sister's choices. "I was wrong about you, Evanthe," Clarissa wrote in a letter that arrived on a crisp December morning, her handwriting shaky with emotion. "I thought you were foolish to choose love over security, naive to believe that happiness mattered more than social position. But I see now that you were the brave one, the wise one. I married for position and wealth, and I am miserable every day of my life. My husband treats me like a beautiful ornament, useful for entertaining his associates, but otherwise ignored. I have everything I thought I wanted, and I have never been more unhappy." The letter continued for several pages, concluding, "Perhaps we might correspond again. I find myself in need of a sister's wisdom, and I hope it's not too late to repair the damage my jealousy and short-sightedness have caused." Even more gratifying was the flood of professional opportunities that came Evanthe's way following the trial. Publishers competed to print her articles on social reform, women's rights, and the dangers of unchecked corporate power. She was invited to speak at universities, women's clubs, and reform organizations across the country, her story serving as inspiration for a new generation of women who refused to accept the limitations society tried to place upon them. "You've become quite famous," Tobias observed one snowy evening, as they sorted through the latest batch of speaking invitations and interview requests. "The woman who said no to a duke and brought down an empire. I'm married to a celebrity. I prefer to think of myself as the woman who said yes to her own life," Evanthe replied, settling into her husband's arms before their fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows across their book-lined study. Everything else was just the natural consequence of that choice. Their life together had indeed blossomed beyond anything Evanthe could have imagined. Tobias's medical practice had grown to include a free clinic that served Boston's immigrant population, funded in part by the proceeds from Evanthe's writing and speaking engagements. Their home had become a gathering place for reformers, artists, and progressive thinkers who valued ideas over inheritance and character over connections. They had also become foster parents to 3 children from the immigrant community siblings whose parents had died in a tenement fire, leaving them with no family and no resources. In Duke Caspian's world, such children would have been invisible. But in the Reed household, they were cherished members of the family. "Mama Evanthe," called little Sophia, the youngest of their foster children, running into the study with her dark curls bouncing and her eyes bright with excitement. "Papa Tobias says you're going to speak to the ladies at the big school tomorrow. Will you tell them about the mean duke who tried to buy you?" Evanthe laughed, lifting the 6-year-old onto her lap. "I'll tell them about the importance of choosing your own path, sweetheart, about how every person, man or woman, rich or poor, has the right to decide their own destiny." "Even little girls like me?" Sophia asked, her accent still carrying traces of her Italian heritage. "Especially little girls like you," Evanthe assured her, smoothing the child's unruly curls. "You can grow up to be anything you want to be. A doctor like Papa Tobias, a writer like me, or something entirely different that no one has even thought of yet." On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their windows and the warmth of their love filled every corner of their modest but comfortable home, Evanthe understood that she had indeed bloomed where she was planted, not in the artificial hothouse of Duke Caspian's empire, where she would have been a beautiful but lifeless ornament, but in the rich soil of authentic choice, genuine love, and purposeful work. The woman who had once been valued only for her beauty and breeding had become something far more precious, a person of substance, courage, and conviction. She had learned that true wealth lay not in bank accounts or social position, but in the richness of human connection, the satisfaction of meaningful work, and the freedom to choose one's own values and live by them. Duke Caspian had offered her his entire fortune to say yes to his proposal, believing that money could buy anything and anyone. But Evanthe had discovered something infinitely more valuable than his wealth: the priceless treasure of a life lived on her own terms, surrounded by people who loved her not for what she could provide them, but for who she truly was. In choosing to say no to a life of gilded captivity, she had said yes to everything that truly mattered. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next.